Thanks for joining. I am a sociology professor. I'm at Amherst University in Calgary, and this is my 11th year on master's and PhD at the University of Waterloo in sociology. And Josh invited me to share a little bit of research with nuns in Canada. A couple of years ago, I wrote a book titled The Meaning of Sunday, and devoted a couple of chapters. So I'm just going to pause there. If you're not speaking, we'll just have you mute your microphones so we can eliminate a bunch of the background noise. A couple years ago, wrote a book, The Meaning of Sunday, where I devote a couple of chapters to religious nuns based on interviews with religious nuns in Canada. And last month, I submitted with a colleague from the University of Waterloo, Dr. Sarah Wilkins-Laflamme, a full manuscript on religious nuns in Canada and the United States. And so I'm going to share just a few things in the next 4 or 5 minutes to launch us into some conversation, and then happy to follow different trajectories that pique your interest, things that maybe I don't address that would be of value to you. So you may or may not know, but 1/4 of Canadian adults say they have no religion. 28% of Canadian millennials say they have no religion, and 32% of Canadian teenagers say they have no religion. Demographically, religious nuns tend to be more males than females tend to say they have no religion. They tend to be a younger demographic, tend not to be married or have children. And geographically, if you start on the East Coast and move west, with the exception of Quebec, and we'll say in a moment, you've religious nuns increase the further west you go, and the lowest rates of religious nuns are in Quebec. Why do we see so many people say they have no religion? Why has this grown over time? There's a few different reasons sociologically that we talk about. One pertains to social acceptance. The social environment that we find ourselves in plays a role in how we identify, how we see ourselves, and how others see us. And it's frankly more socially acceptable today than, say, half a century ago in Canada to say you have no religion. And so we've seen an increase over time. The main pathway or trajectory for people to say they have no religion is to formally be raised within a religious tradition, and then to set that religious tradition behind. So sociologists talk about apostasy, and there's all kinds of reasons that I talk about in The Meaning of Sunday for why people leave their religion. But we are seeing, interestingly, a shift toward those who are raised without any religion. That is, religious nuns who have children who then raise them without any formal religious affiliation or involvement. And so this is attention to sociologically that we anticipate will contribute to at least a stability or possible continued growth in those who say they have no religion, as irreligious socialization within the home takes place. How do religious nuns view the world? How do they view spirituality and so forth? One of the things I talk about in The Meaning of Sunday is that they are passionate about the belief that they are open-minded and free and liberated. And these are things that they compare and contrast with religious groups. The perception is that if you identify with a religion, if you're actively involved with a religion, you therefore are not open-minded, are not free, and are not tolerant. And in some ways, they draw this Canadian distinction that, you know, to be open-minded and tolerant and free is to be fully Canadian. And therefore, to be actively religious is perhaps in some ways for religious nuns to be not fully Canadian because you don't embrace these kinds of values. When it comes to individual beliefs and practices, we can go in all kinds of directions, but I would say that it's important to know that religious nuns are homogeneous group. Some believe in God, some believe in a supernatural being, some do not. Some pray, some do not. Some believe in the afterlife, some do not, and so forth. Simply put, we shouldn't assume that all religious nuns are atheists, for example. We shouldn't assume that all religious nuns are against religion. There really is a full spectrum of different beliefs and practices, though no doubt they seem to be more secular in orientation than those who identify with a religion and are actively involved. They claim to have meaning and purpose in life. They don't believe that they're lacking meaning and purpose, which religious groups, I think, consistently will contend that religion is the main place you find meaning and purpose. Religious nuns talk about their family and friends and relationships and jobs and volunteer activities as a great source of meaning and purpose for them within their life. And the final thing I'll say about kind of their worldview is that they're principally opposed to those who seek to impose their beliefs or practices onto them. There is this aversion to forced religion of any kind. And interestingly, I would say most religious nuns in Canada, there isn't this desire to somehow impose their own view on the world onto other people as well. And I think there's part of a Canadian narrative within that probably sets religious nuns apart from those in the United States. Where are religious nuns going? And I'll conclude with this and then open up for some conversation. I think our best estimates from the data that we have is that we should anticipate religious nuns will at the very least remain stable in terms of the proportionate size of the Canadian population, but will likely continue to grow. How large, it's difficult to know. Lots of different variables that impact that, but returning to where we started, irreligious socialization, religious nuns having religious nuns is a key driver in shaping some of those trajectories. So I'll use that as an opening. Lots of things, lots of directions we could go in, and happy to engage, drawing on some of the empirical data, some of the questions and thoughts that you might have.
Thank you, Joel. That was very concise and informative. I hope you're still hungry to read the books. It's just freelance now, so if anyone has comments or you want to kick it off, step in, just unmute yourself. I'm here just to facilitate and listen and learn, just like all of us. I've got some things myself, I've taken notes, but I'm going to yield. So jump in.
Just a watching kind of thing. Glenn, I can only see your nose and your mouth. Other way. Now I can see your shirt. Go the other way. Up, 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 up. Now I can see your shirt buttons on your stomach. I just can't see your face.
Glenn, can you hear? Coming in clear? Other way. Lost Glenn. Maybe another order of business when you just introduce yourself and maybe the context of when you're first speaking, where you're from. At the risk of pushing in too early, I'm going to kick off with some curiosity. Thank you, Joel. That was really interesting. I found myself a religious nun for not an N-U-N, an N-O-N-E, until maybe last February. Life circumstance had me thrust into something I needed, and it's cool because even just being in this space, I haven't formally introduced myself to any of you. I work with EDGE, the R&D team of the United Church. There's a lot of authenticity and realness in holding the whole human experience in progressive theology. And there was a hospital building a mental health campus close to me in the east end of Toronto. They had a fundraiser at a park a few weeks ago, and they had a little soccer net where you could write something and say, "Kick a stigma." And what I wrote was, what was it? Faith communities aren't progressive. And I think in some ways, I'm trying to kick that stigma that I've also applied to myself, and as a former religious nun, applied to religious communities. So if anyone wants to pick up on that or riff with me on that, I'd love advice and thoughts, anything, gentle criticisms.
Thanks, Scott. Go ahead, Marlene. Sorry.
Oh, okay. So I'm curious to know if this group is experiencing an internal challenge in almost a fear that traditional worship practices are in jeopardy if we look at doing alternate programming and subsequently finding support to sort of go outside the box in terms of programming or ideas. It's already a challenge to reach out to the broader community and offer something that isn't traditional but then you do need to obtain the support internally to go out and do this type of programming. I'm just wondering if anyone has any experience in the best way to deliver new programming without anyone feeling like existing programming is threatened. You know, like I think more specifically, we've heard feedback that inviting people to Sunday worship, the phrase Sunday worship, is intimidating to some people. It's not that they don't believe in God. It's just the whole idea of worship isn't something they're comfortable with. Talking about Jesus, talking about God, not something they're comfortable with, but Christian principles are something they are comfortable with. Giving back to their community is something that people are comfortable with. And I've heard it said, and I don't know who said it, but I've heard it said around here, that our commonalities, faith is not required for common values. And so there's a lot of programming happening here that we'd like to, that people aren't meeting on the same, I guess in the same space, with it being, you know, with Christianity being the motivation from our traditional members versus wanting to be a good person and giving back to the community being where some of our community members are coming from. So that's my big, giant, loaded question.
So then, Marlene, what makes us different from the Lions Club or the Rotary Club or whatever? I mean, they all give back to their community, and so do countless other community agencies. Where do we find that difference, or how can we be different but the same, I guess is what I would ask.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then why are the evangelical churches and the churches that are aiming at young folk more with praise choruses and the big churches and the multiple staff thriving, and we are not as a mainline? I'm in the United Church of Canada. I'm guessing all of you are. I might have missed the introductions, but I don't know. And, you know, we're a dying denomination right now. We're struggling. So, you know, that would be my comment. I don't really have any brilliant ideas or thoughts. I mean, I have some thoughts. I don't know if they're brilliant, but that would be my response initially.
Mm. So, yeah, finding that key point of differentiation. You know, what is it about the United Church? And I'm with Fairlawn Avenue United Church in Toronto, Ontario. I'm their director of church operations. And we have just actually received a Presbytery grant to engage in research within the community and within our own congregation to identify needs so that our programming is addressing needs as opposed to things we think might be a good idea. We're actually going to focus on what the community and our internal community is telling us. So that's sort of a starting point for us. But I am seeing when people start talking about, you know, we're going to have a second ministry and we're going to do it off-site and we're going to do it this way and that way, I can see the tension or the trepidation. And I sort of look at attracting this group is one thing, but having our existing congregation not feel threatened is a whole other project that needs to be happening in parallel to that.
Maybe I'll try cutting in here. I hope people can hear me. My name is Ian Kellogg. I'm the minister at Millwoods United Church in Alberta. And I think this is quite a relevant topic for the United Church because as Susan, I guess, just suggested, the United Church is dying. You know, we're down about 90% in my lifetime in absolute terms. Among 15 to 29-year-olds, about 99% down. And our new moderator, the Right Reverend Richard Bott, in one of his articles in The Observer said that you know, the United Church isn't dying, in his opinion. It's failing because of lack of mission. I disagree with him. I think that what we're failing at is dying. I mean, it's clear that we're dying, and so that seems to be our task, is to die. which to me is a very Christ-like thing to do, because it's the way of the cross, and it's confronting our mortality individually, and in this case institutionally. I mean, in terms of religious nuns, I'm an ordained minister in the United Church. I've been ordained for 7.5 years. I'm really loving this second career, but I would consider myself a religious nun. That is, to me, the path of spiritual development and of seeking enlightenment and of engaging in the world and of following the path that's laid out in the stories of Jesus is one of discarding traditions and discarding beliefs. I think that the Gospel of Mark was written when Jerusalem was burned to the ground and the temple was taken apart stone by stone, was to help Jews at that time in and around the Mediterranean to say, our dream of a new King David is gone. So where is the Christ? And Paul would say the Christ is within. And it seems that Yahweh has been murdered in his earthly temple. So how can we continue to worship God when our tribal God is clearly been killed by the Romans? And the answer is, the era of tribal gods is gone, and we need to do something that's more universal, something that is around love and not about a particular tribe, not around Zeus or Yahweh or Baal or whatever, but something. And so to me, what's happening in our culture for the last 50 and 100 years in the West is sort of similar to what the Jewish people around the Mediterranean were facing after the destruction of Jerusalem. There's a lot of provocative statements, but on the other hand, we also have a fight back against the rise of irreligiosity. I'm just really struck that we're talking on the morning after the President of the United States, who's supported by white evangelicals so clearly in the United States, has publicly mocked a survivor of sexual assault. And so, there's an attempt to say, oh my gosh, patriarchy is going and we're going to have every place in the world is going to be like Toronto with a majority minority, and there won't be white dominance anymore. And the white church in the United States, on its conservative wing and its larger wing, is essentially saying, yeah, we're in favor of rape culture. We're in favor of ethnic cleansing. We're in favor of white supremacy. And so why wouldn't you be a religious nun in that kind of context?
I think it's a good time for Joel to answer the conversation.
I want to be cognizant of the internal conversation too, and so I want to give space for that. Maybe just a few thoughts from sociology and some data that we have. I think looking at the United Church of Canada, it is important to pay attention to demographic shifts. So when we talk about declines, I mean, a couple of the reasons that the United Church of Canada faces the declines that it does has to do with a changing immigration pipeline, so to speak, from Western Europe that fed not only the United Church of Canada, but many of the mainline Protestant traditions through mid-20th century and sort of for the next 30 years or so forth. The United Church of Canada doesn't benefit as much any longer from that. Aging congregations, these things, but this factors very much into why you confront some of the declines. And so when we talk about what does organizational health and sustainability look like, both in the short and the long term, paying careful attention to, and I think, Marlene, some of your questions get at this of how do we engage different demographics and so forth. And I think Susan's observation is spot on of, okay, well, what therefore is different about this church from the Lions Club and so forth? And I think that's a really important question to grapple with. I think one of the unique particular things of the United Church of Canada relative to other denominations across Christianity is it's very well known for being actively engaged within the community, for being on the front lines on a variety of what I'll call, broadly speaking, social justice issues that resonate with Canadians by and large, that I think there is an opportunity to leverage and to continue to lean into those things, but to also ask the very difficult question, okay, what therefore makes us different and distinct as and if I can say, as a Christian community relative to all of these other groups. And I think sometimes the lines are blurred when I think some might perceive this is great, the United Church of Canada, its members are actively involved in all these initiatives and holding these different things, but there isn't anything qualitatively different in the minds of others of what sets the United Church of Canada apart. And so I think there, and I'm not at all here to speak into how one should think about their theology, but how do we talk about our theology and frame our theology within those contexts to make that very very explicit within the process, I think is important. And how do we frame that narrative? So the tension of, well, the old guard doesn't want to see new things happen. I think trying to frame narratives from those who are in leadership in a way that talks about, what are we passing on to the next generation? I think there's very few grandparents who are actively involved in churches who don't want to see their grandkids also actively involved. And how do we frame those kinds of narratives in a way that doesn't convey a sense of loss, but conveys a sense that we have shared interests and values and so forth that help us to advance some of the shared interests. So just a few initial thoughts. There's lots that can be said in different directions within that context. So I'll step out for the moment as we continue to.
Thanks, Joe. Marlene, it looked like you might have had something. I don't want to put you on the spot.
No, that's really good, and I think there is a real nugget in the what are we passing on to the next generation, and what are those interests and values? What are they anchored to? And what brings us together? So I was just sort of nodding and smiling because what everyone has been saying is really helping to solidify thoughts in my mind. So thank you all for that.
Hi there. I am sorry to have been a bit late to the conversation. I'm Sonia Wu Winter. I'm working with Harcourt United Church in Guelph, Ontario. And Harcourt is starting to look at how it can, just like many of you have mentioned, how it can engage the community in new and different ways. And one narrative that they're really leaning on is this idea of joining with what God is doing out in the community rather than sort of that doing for. And so I think one question that Harcourt is facing is, what does it look like to partner with the community, which would include religious nuns and duns and others, but in a way that might not necessarily have any other agenda to bring them within the fold, so to speak. So how to do that engagement, that partnering, that joining with, in an open-ended way that isn't necessarily hoping that those folks might come within the church walls and sit in the church pews. And I think that, I realize that's a slightly different question than what we've been talking about, which is, how to share the life of the community of the church in an open way with people who have a varied history with that experience. Anyway, I just wanted to introduce myself and kind of let folks know the perspective I'm wrestling with and wondering in my work with Harcourt.
One of the things with which we've been wrestling here at Princess Street United Church in Kingston, where I'm the minister, is what are the reasons for what we want to do? If we want to partner with others in the community and take ministry beyond our walls, what is the theological rationale, if you will? I know that's an old school term, but what's at the core of what we're doing? Is that because that's what God's calling us to do and what, WWJD, or that what would Jesus do, for those of you who may not be familiar with that? Is that where the Spirit is nudging us? Or are we saying we can't survive here on our own? We need to partner with other community groups in order to keep our building open. What's going on underneath? And that's where we're at as we struggle with the very same things that my friends in Texas would say you all are talking about. I suspect many of us are in that same situation in our churches. And when I mentioned before about some of our, say, evangelical sisters and brothers or independent community churches, one of the things I notice about the folks I know who attend those churches is there's a real sense of the Spirit and what God is doing in their lives. And they live that out and they carry that out into the world in many ways. Sometimes not so much, but I wrestle with that in my own context and in my own life to say, as the clergy, the leader here, or the so-called leader, why are we doing what we're doing? And that's a long blurb, and I'll be quiet now for others, but that's what's going on for me right now.
So another project I'm part of looks at flourishing congregations in Canada. Where are the signs of life and vitality in Catholic, mainline, conservative Protestant churches? And I know I haven't been invited to speak on that. I'm here to talk about religious nuns, but two things stand out from that project that intersect with the last couple of observations. One is that congregations that flourish are clear on their identity. They're clear on who they are, where they've come from, where they're going. And so I think in this conversation of when a church is seeking to reach out and partner with different groups with no intent necessarily, or at least this isn't the lead card of drawing people into one's organization, fair enough. I think being clear on whatever those aims and objectives are for a group is really, really important. However theologically defined, whether they're practically defined, etc., in terms of the need to partner with others. I would say from an organizational standpoint, and this maybe loops back to some of the observations that Ian made earlier, at the end of the day, if you don't have people in your churches, you don't have an organization that's viable or sustainable in the short or long term. And I'm not arguing that we need large churches or that you need a minimum threshold, but you do need human and financial resources to sustain an organization. And so I think within one's theological framing as well as one's practical framing, to consider, are there ways of bringing both of these aspects together, of both reaching out with any stated intent that one needs to land within one's congregation, but also have an eye towards actually the resources internally are essential for the short and long-term viability. In the case of, I think, all of you, your literal jobs and occupations and vocations in the short and long term, but also from a broad denominational perspective to keep in mind as well.
Thanks, Joe. I got something to add to that, connected to something that you said at the very beginning about Canadian identity being associated with being like almost antithetical to religion, in that being free, open-minded, and tolerant is religious nuns may, correct me if I'm wrong, see people who are part of faith communities as insular and not, because having more of a predisposed affinity to others within that faith community, and therefore less tolerant. Is that along the lines of something you said?
Yep, absolutely.
There's something to be said, like I think about what Ian was saying about right-wing evangelicals in America and being directly related to the most powerful office in the world. I don't even know how to finish that sentence. It's kind of, I wish I never had to say that. They're so connected with one another that it's become a national identity. And I was at my uncle's Roman Catholic church in New Jersey a few months ago, and on Saturday morning they do like a scripture reading, and then they kind of get in like a delving deeper type of thing. And they do the Pledge of Allegiance before anything. So you're pledging your allegiance to a nation state for the greater kingdom of transcendent love. And that's not evangelical right wing, but there's just something there that's very closely like Christian America is America, white America is America, and it all gets conflated. If anyone wants to speak to that, I'm curious and interested. These are no answers, just frustrations.
Well, maybe I'll provide some data in response, because I'm sure we all have lots of opinions on what this looks like. But there's no doubt that religious nuns in the U.S. in particular, one of the reasons that they are averse to religion is because of the strong tie between the Christian right and politics. And while we're in Canada and we have a very different structure and system, our proximity, geographic proximity, media proximity and consumption to the U.S. shapes people's perceptions, so that even in Canada, people, particularly respective to evangelicals, religious nuns, continue to make these assertions that, well, you're an evangelical and you must be like the ones down south. Or if we broaden the tent a little bit, oh, you're a Christian, you must be like these other religious folks south of the border. And so in our forthcoming book on religious nuns in Canada and the US, we asked some questions of members of different religious traditions in Canada, as well as religious nuns, how they view members of other religious traditions. And unsurprisingly, atheists in Canada have the most disdain toward evangelicals, and vice versa. Evangelicals hold the most negative feelings toward atheists. And these are not as pronounced as you find in the United States, but they are still there. And I would say sociologically is definitely informed by what we see in the United States. And again, I think in the case of the United Church of Canada, this is one of the great leverage points that you have relative to other traditions is you don't carry much of that baggage that other traditions do. It's one less barrier that you have in engaging religious nuns. And in many respects, theology in and through the United Church of Canada is far more resonant with, I would say, the average Canadian. You look at the history of how the United Church of Canada is formed and developed, etc. I think to lean into those strengths is one of those niche advantages that evangelicals and other traditions do not have.
This is Ian again. I'd like to jump in. To get back to a point that Susan made a while ago, what is the difference between a United Church of Canada congregation and the Rotary Club? And I see the differences being that we are explicitly faith-based. That is, we're looking for sources of trust spiritually in the world, and we come out of a Christian tradition. But one of the key things in this crazy moment that I focus on as a spiritual leader is our role against idolatry. Because where I see idolatry right now in its most negative aspect is the political support that's given to misogynistic and racist and militaristic leaders here, there, and everywhere all around the world by religious leaders, which really does fuel the rise of the nuns. I mean, and I call it the Taliban effect. Essentially, I see the Donald Trump presidency as like the Afghan Taliban. It's a pseudo-religious leadership that is supported by fake Christians who are fundamentalists, similarly to how the Taliban government in Afghanistan before it was overthrown in 2001 was supported by fake Muslim leaders who were fundamentalist and whose basic. So when we could say this is a U.S. phenomenon. It's the Catholic Church in Hungary. It's the Orthodox churches in Russia supporting Putin. But we also have it here in Canada with evangelical support for Doug Ford's thuggish rule in Ontario. And I mean, I'm speaking with a lot of anger. I mean, to me, when we're fighting idolatry, following the second commandment in the book of Exodus, we're confronting our religious ecumenical colleagues. I mean, I'm disgusted by what's happening in the United States for the last 3 years and what happened last night in Mississippi with the president. But what that means is that Franklin Graham, I am disgusted by him and enraged by him. And the 700 Club, I am disgusted by it. And they are the enemy, just as much as the Taliban or Al-Qaeda or ISIS are the enemy of Muslims. So we, as people who try to uphold a particular path, which is progressive and modern and non-idolatrous to the extent that we can do that, and it's very hard for any of us not to be idolatrous. It's sort of a universal phenomenon, in my opinion. But the religious nuns are our allies in that. And I think Joel is right. The United Church would make an excellent place for religious nuns to gather, but we have a lot of baggage in terms of our WASP background and our aging congregations, and just a confusion about so many things, in my opinion. But anyway, some thoughts.
I actually have a thought and would love any feedback or thoughts on it. And one of the strategies we were going to try here, because we haven't done a really good job of opening up and inviting the neighborhood or the community into participating in any of the outreach that we do or the programs that we have, is our strategy was to find ways to provide people with an easy point of entry into doing something that gave them that really good feeling that I know we're all familiar with when giving of yourself to another, whether that be at a food bank, whether it be dropping off a can of food, whether that is participating in making sandwiches to take downtown to a drop-in shelter, whatever. There's a ton of opportunities. So the previous I guess administration here had tried to almost apply a business scheme to how to bring someone in and migrate them through a process whereby they became members. But it's such a varied individual experience. I don't think that you can do that, or maybe you can and we just didn't figure it out, but it was a good effort nonetheless. The thought now is, let's open up so that we give people the opportunity to have the experience, and those that are moved by that will move further into being integrated with our church community or not. But the idea is to provide the experience as a means to engage with the community. I don't know if anyone has any comments or thoughts on that.
I think there's good data, Marlene. Sorry, Michelle, you go ahead.
Thanks, Joel. Hi, I'm Michelle. I'm a layperson, and I work on a communications team for a church here in Toronto. I agree with Marlene. I think in answer to somebody's question, what is our legacy? I think that where I see attraction with younger families and youth is that the United Church of Canada does social justice and outreach really, really well. We do it so well. And anytime in my experience of doing communications and being a webmaster and networking on social media, I can get religious nuns and duns. I can get them interested in refugee resettlement. I can get them interested in outreach for homelessness. I can get them interested in youth. I think really, really, really well. And so I agree, Marlene, that it is a way to get people to come in, especially privileged people like we are. We're all privileged. We're so privileged. And when we get that sort of little feel-good feeling that we're doing something good with that privilege, I see it work really well in our community. And it is a way to engage and get out on the street.
I'd like to add something quickly to that. I think this is my analogy for, since we're talking about evangelical, like almost a dichotomy between progressive faith, or I guess the span of where people, different communities of faith, draw membership from. And this is what faith has been like to me. I think some of what Joel said, religious nuns really are averse to the far right, and that kind of drives them away from faith overall. And I have the hand like that. And faith at its best, I think, really draws us inwards to say, how am I using my privilege to stand in solidarity with the oppressed, right? And at its worst is that I have a closer affinity to God, and my way is right, and I am more sacred than you. And how are you? What are you? And that's really that's a nice visualization I'd like to share. again, no, nothing useful beyond that.
Three observations from some of the things we know in data. One, I think it's really important when we talk about this gap between religious nuns and evangelicals, or even within or across theological continuum, to be mindful that there is variation within any of the religious traditions that we talk about. And one of the classic sociological flaws that we make is we describe other groups as homogeneous. Everyone in that group is the same, but our group is highly diverse and different. And so as we talk about even evangelicals within Canada, there is a broad spectrum that some, I would say a small minority from the data we have, align with some of the things that we find in the United States and shapes how religious nuns engage these things. But there is some diversity within these groups. The second, I would say, Marlene, I think the process and structures and systems you talk about are really, really important. And I think creating that open opportunities and invitation is essential. One of the things we know in terms of the lead reason for why a person joins a religious group, regardless of religion, regardless of time, history, and context, pertains to personal invitation. And when a person has a personal contact that may grow out of a personal experience, let's say they volunteer to help with the food bank with members of your church, that members of your church then make personal contacts with individuals there, they have a good positive experience, they want to come back and hang out with those people, etc. That those things are really important. I think part of the challenge for congregations is how do we provide a compelling story and narrative to those who are within our congregation to really value the necessity of building friendships and relationships with new people into our sphere and into, if I could call it, our social club, so that people feel welcomed and embraced, that they want to become more involved. I think it's rare in all kinds of settings that people just reciprocate with greater levels of involvement without those personal ties. And I think this ties to my third point on that intergenerational transmission. How do you particularly keep and retain the young people within your congregational settings? Involves including them and giving them space and voice within congregational life, a sense of ownership and leadership, whether it's in volunteering and also helping as family units, for example, in the food bank drives or what have you, that those kinds of experiences and personal trust and relationships can go a long way to contributing to them sticking around an organization short and long term.
I just wanted to add a comment about like the family structure of churches that I've been involved with, and where like my parents, they don't go to my church. They've never been United Church members. They've never gone to church. My daughter goes and she participates quite a bit. And my husband goes when I drag him to come, he'll come. But what I'm saying is that what I've seen in many congregations is that, and this is a selling point, is that you can replace those relationships that you don't necessarily have in your life. Like my grandparents have all passed on. So I have a whole slew of grandparents at the United Church, my home church that I attend, and their grandkids don't come to our church. So for that time that we spend together, whether it's during the week at a craft conversation group, or if it's in Sunday worship, those relationships are being fulfilled in a different way, not through blood relations. And we have a lot of single people and widowed people, and so they create new family networks. So I really love that dynamic. I know my mom and dad will never come to our church. I know they just never will. And it makes me sad because I have such joy there. But I think we need to look for these people that need to replace those types of relationships, whether it's a partner, grandparents, children, or they don't have children, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, thanks.
I'd like to jump back in with something that I don't remember who said it. Might have been our leader here. But talking about the UCC demographic shifts. And one of the points you made was immigration, which we had a lot of, 40, 50, 60 years ago from the European community and et cetera. one of the challenges and perhaps an opportunity that I've discovered recently here, I've been in Kingston for 3.5 years, and as you know, it's the bastion of Upper Canada. However, we have a lot of students here as well, and many of them do not know what the United Church is because they come from a country where the United Church does not exist. So I think that's a challenge to get the message out, who we are, what do we do, how do we reach people to let them know about our, excuse my language, liberal leanings, our way of being, our social justice, our engagement with social issues, etc. I think there's a real opportunity there. And that's what gets me back to why are we doing what we're doing, and who is our, I come from a marketing background, who's our target market? You know, what is it that we're really trying to do here? So I just put that out there in line with the immigration comment that was made, because there were a lot of folks coming into Canada now who have backgrounds in churches that are around the world. For example, the Roman Catholic tradition, the whatever, Episcopalian and Anglican communion, but not the United Church. So I don't know where that leaves us. It's just a comment in response.
Maybe I'll jump in on immigration. I mean, Joel was talking about, you know, that Canadianness of openness and inclusiveness and freedom, and one of the areas where Canadians who are long settled in Canada are negative towards immigration is the religiosity of immigrants. I mean, the Roman Catholic Church has declined even more than the United Church of Canada in my lifetime, except for immigrants from places like the Philippines. But there's also this understanding among many people that, well, it's, you know, when somebody comes from the Punjab, they're going to go to the Sikh Gurdwara, but their grandchildren will not, thank goodness. And, you know, the Roman Catholic churches are now filled with Filipino immigrants, and that's fantastic for the Roman Catholic Church, but their grandchildren will be indistinguishable culturally from the very secular Canadian majority who've been here for 5, 10, 15, 20 generations in the terms of Quebec, let's say. So it's just an interesting phenomenon. And one of the things that's different in my observation between evangelicals in Canada and the States is that the conservative evangelical churches like Pentecostalism and the Alliance denomination are much more intercultural here in Canada than perhaps in many places in the United States. And so, you know, you can't be about ethnic cleansing and about white supremacy if your congregation is United Nations of immigrants. Here in Millwoods, it's the most intercultural neighborhood in Alberta, and we're a relatively normal United Church in that we're mostly WASPs. But the Pentecostal churches, which are quite large here, it's just remarkable to go and worship there on a Sunday. The left is surrounded from every single corner of the earth.
Thanks, Ian. Try not to jump in again. Anyone else want to pick up from there or enter a new thought as we wind down?
I'll just add that the empirical data reinforces all of the previous comments that have been made, that these things are definitely clear and present there.
Thanks, Joel. I think we all have senses of things, but it's hard to know what's real, and data is real. I have something to ask you about your intro again. You said something about social acceptance, and more acceptable today than 100 years ago to say that you're a religious nun. If you want to call that tribalism or kinship or affiliation. Something that I wrote down on my sheet here was that age of isolation. I think what that meant was that we have loneliness ministers, and we're living in the stage of chronic loneliness. A lot of my personal work, ministry through the United Church, is based on, I'm sure many of you have heard of Harvard Divinity School's How We Gather. and it's a document that a couple people put together saying that there are some key institutions that post-boomers who are not engaged by traditional religious institutions are flocking towards: co-working spaces, CrossFit gyms, places of I can't remember who it was, perhaps Susan. Someone was saying about parallel, what makes us different? What makes us different than a Rotary Club? So it has that same sense of community and higher purpose of service. There's something more than that, though, because my family, for example, we talked about colonization a little bit, is from Goa, India. And although there wasn't a perfect history of colonization, when Christians came to Goa, what happened was Goans were freed of the caste system. It's one of the few places in the world that said, oh, I'm just as divine as everybody else, and I can transcend this. It was incredible. That was a nice little welcome learning for me as I re-entered faith. So I wonder, Joel, or any of you, if you could speak to the idea of being able to be socially acceptable as a person of faith and not having any stigma attached to you in an era of isolation, where I'm personally finding so much acceptance in this group of, in my congregation.
Sorry, Joel. I've talked about this before in previous Zooms, but I get labeled as the church lady, and it's really hard for me to get away from that stigma. I try and act really cool, and I am really hip, but still people think that I am this holy roller. And I do a lot of community engagement, a lot of community networking. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, all the time, seeing what's going on within the community. I have clients that are in the private sector and also not-for-profit. So I have to work myself and show different facets of myself, but I cannot break this holy roller thing that people think of me. I don't know. I don't know what to do. Maybe I should just start dressing differently or get a motorcycle. I'm not sure.
No, claim it, own it, claim it, make it work.
Yeah, I think you're hip and doing the right things, Michelle. I think, social perceptions are a funny thing, and you can only control what you can control in shaping and changing people's perceptions. And there's so many other things that are at work. And the reality is, I've talked about this in my last book and our forthcoming one, we reiterate this, that the stigma in Canada is largely reserved for those who identify as religious and are actively religious. And the stigma is gone more or less for those who say they have no religion, versus the United States, where a stigma is very high still. To say you have no religion, the comparison is that one needs to, quote unquote, come out as a religious nun because of the social stigma they face with friends, family, neighbors, etc. So all I can say is the empirical data reinforces, I think, some of the sentiments experienced here within a Canadian context. And that you need to continue, as you're doing, to leverage and build those strong, positive feelings and experiences with those within your sphere. And I think this discussion of people who feel lonely or disconnected and can find community in and through local churches, that is absolutely one of the functions that local congregations fulfill. But we shouldn't be naive in thinking that churches are the only place where people can find community and their loneliness can be alleviated, etc. But it is one place, and we should use the strengths and resources we have to build in that capacity for people within our communities.
Thank you, Joe. That's a nice little humility to end on. Maybe a little quick popcorn style to fade out if anyone has something they took away, if they want to express, or anything at all. Leave it open to interpretation.
Well, I'm grateful for everyone's openness, and that, there are some struggles, whether it be how people look at us individually and as a holy roller, or whether it is how challenging it is to really wrap our heads around what we need to do. It's nice to know that, you know, I'm grateful, Edge, to you for setting this up. So I don't know, I guess I don't feel so isolated in this challenge, and just knowing that it's a big challenge for all of us. So not that I'm happy we all have this challenge, but you know, I'm happy we're experiencing it and going through it together, and hopefully we'll come out on the plus side. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Marlene. Thanks, Ian. I acknowledge your comment on the chat.
I'll just echo Marlene's comment. This is my first conversation with Edge, and so it's just great to have conversation partners. I didn't know this existed until about a week ago, so I hope to take part in more. And it's great to be in a group that's talking about these things. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Okay, I'm just honoring everyone's time. I want to end with a note of gratitude to Joel. Did I miss anyone? Does anyone else want to speak?
I will say one last thing, but I can go after you if you want, Josh, or whatever.
Yeah, I'll let you end it. So I'll just give that gratitude to you, Joel. I know it's the middle of the day and a snowstorm. You're writing books, doing research. We're grateful for your time. Thank you for being with us.
No, thanks. My pleasure. One thing I'll mention that might be of value in your own context is this other research I mentioned on flourishing congregations. If you go to flourishingcongregations.org, you can learn a bit more about that research, but importantly, there's a link there. We're doing a national survey with congregations across the country, across theological traditions. One of the things we're offering is a free report with data specific to your congregation. So if that's of interest to you, feel free to check it out. We're also hosting an event at Ambrose at the end of November with religious leaders across Christian traditions across Canada, looking at flourishing congregations. What can we learn? What are some best practices, etc. So again, just want to put that out there if that's of interest, and if we can be of help and service to those within your context, I would be happy to do that. So yeah, but again, just thanks. Great to be part of the conversation today.
Thank you. Okay, we'll log off, and I'll send this out shortly. Thanks to everyone. And I'll send that flourishing congregation info as well with the follow-up in the video.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.